everyone to the School of Advanced Study to Senate House, the University of London. My name is Corinne Lennox, and I'm a senior lecturer in human rights here and also co-director of the Human Rights Consortium, which sits in the School of Advanced Studies. We're very pleased to be collaborating tonight with a number of partners to host the event, including Conectas Human Rights Brazil, the Fund for Global Human Rights, the Funders Initiative for Civil Society, the Center for Applied Human Rights at the University of York, and the Global Governance Institute from University College London. What all of our institutions have in common is a common program of work to support human rights defenders of various types, whether they're from NGOs, the legal community, academics, or leaders of social movements. For example, here at the Human Rights Consortium, we've specialized in the last year and a half or so in supporting human rights researchers through initiatives like the Human Rights Researchers Network that are under attack themselves. So in this work, we're all well aware of the increasing challenges that these various actors face in protecting human rights, and also in protecting themselves in the face of direct persecution and also decreasing space for freedom to raise human rights concern. But tonight we want to have a slightly different focus, less on the diagnostic of the problem and more on the responses that we can make to this problem of the so-called shrinking space. And we will be discussing three strands: resistance, resilience, and resources. And we encourage contributions and questions from the floor that focus on these three topics. So what sort of resistance is working and what isn't? What kinds of well-being strategies have been adopted by activists? How have funders been dealing with challenges of ensuring continued resources? And what kind of non-financial resources can be offered? All of these kinds of efforts and innovation are needed to push back against the negative trends that we're witnessing. Tonight we're drawing our inspiration from the special issue of the Sur International Journal of Human Rights, which documents the experiences of authors from 16 different countries. You can see on the screen behind me, you can access that journal online, open access, which is a great thing about Sur Journal for researchers and activists everywhere. And hot off the press, free copies at the door. Please take one on your way out. We have several of the contributors to the journal here tonight, so we'll be hearing directly from them. And there will be other launches and presentations of the research in other parts of the world and have been already. We are trying to do some social media, so we do have a Twitter hashtag for tonight, Sur26. So please do share your thoughts and reflections on that. Our colleagues from the fund will be gathering some of those ideas and presenting it through a blog later this week. So each of our panelists will have 10 minutes to discuss the topic. Then we'll have question and answer session. We're also going to have a few contributions from the floor for some academic researchers that have been looking at these issues. We are going to be recording the event for a podcast that will be published online. If anybody has concerns about appearing in that, then please let me or the other organizers know. So let me now introduce our panelists before I invite them to speak. First, to my immediate right is James Savage from the Fund for Global Human Rights, where he's Program Officer on the Enabling Environment for Human Rights Defenders. Through grant making and other tools, the program supports activists to protect and promote civic space and the right to defend human rights at national and local level. He has worked with human rights defenders for more than 20 years, including at Amnesty International and also Peace Brigades International. Next to him, we have Helen Keze-Nwa, who is a Nigerian activist with extensive experience working on women's rights, gender, peace building, conflict resolution, and governance across Africa. She is currently the executive director at ISIS Women's International Cross-Cultural Exchange, based in Uganda, which is a feminist organization that focuses on promoting women's rights in conflict and post-conflict settings. Then next to her we have Juana Quaital, who is the executive director of Conectas Human Rights Brazil, which publishes the journal featuring tonight. She has a master's in international human rights law from the University of Essex and one in political science from the University of Sao Paulo. She serves on various boards, including Global Witness, and on the field panel of the Business and Human Rights Journal, which is published by Cambridge University Press. Then next to her, we have Susan Jessup, who has worked for 9 years in feminist resource mobilization. She is currently the Senior Officer for Content Development at Mama Cash, which is an international fund that supports women's, girls, and trans people's movements around the world. And she focuses on knowledge building and sharing initiatives. And finally, at the end, we have Stefania Compronție, who is the Executive Director of the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union, a human rights NGO. She is a lawyer and sociologist, and also the co-chair of the International Network of Civil Liberties Organizations. She is an advisory board member of the School of Public Life, a community-based research and training center, as well as the Raj Laszlo College for Advanced Studies in Budapest. And I'll introduce our other speakers from the floor when we turn to them. But first, I'd like to invite James to begin.
Great, many thanks, Corinna, and thank you everybody for coming this evening. I'll try and keep my comments relatively brief because I think actually the most interesting perspectives are from the colleagues to my right here on the panel. But I did just want to quickly set some context to the research and the issues that we're going to be discussing this evening in terms of the publication process and just a couple of key takeaways that I got from this collaboration with Conectas. So on the publication process, central to the Fund's programme of promoting an enabling environment for human rights defenders is the objective of supporting activists to counter the global trend of increasingly restrictive legal regimes and non-legal restrictions and violence impacting civil society. And in a conversation with Juana that we were having a year ago, we were reflecting on how most of the literature documenting the global crackdown is, as Corinna was saying, offered a diagnostic of the problems, the causes and the manifestations, but little that examined the nature and the effectiveness of the strategies of resistance and resilience to this. And further, this literature, largely produced by international researchers, tended to feature activist struggles as case studies, and primarily reached practitioners and policymakers in the global north. So in collaborating around publishing the 26th edition of Sur, Conectas and The Fund wanted to put activists centre stage, providing a platform and a process for them to take a step back, to reflect, to assess, and to document the nature and the effectiveness of their strategies, and then to share their insights and their ideas with other activists from the global south, in addition to northern practitioners, policymakers, and funders. So through an open call for papers and targeted invitations to activists to write from a wide array of contexts, we selected, I think, about activists from about 16 countries, for the most part from the global south. But an important added dimension to this publishing process was a 2-day writers' retreat, which Conectas organised, in which they brought together activists who were writing for the journal to share experiences and strategies with one another in how to confront the crackdown, and to provide a forum for peer review of one another's draft texts, which in the pairing of the authors offered a more sort of personalised space for knowledge exchange and peer support, and to participate in a writing skills workshop led by a feminist Brazilian journalist and author. So the centrality of writing to the human rights struggle and to the process of reflection, learning and sharing came through very clearly at this point during the writers' retreat, and is articulated wonderfully, I think, in a short 3-minute extract of the video essay that forms part of the journal that I just want to show you. And this is subtitled, so get your glasses on if you're not wearing them.
Movimento de direitos humanos, temos que renovar nossa linguagem, e o que eu achei mais interessante que apareceu aqui é não perder a política de vista nisso, reforçar nossa linguagem, nos livrar dos jargões e das divisões que fazem parte de qualquer movimento, mas de tentar traduzir, não sei se traduzir é a melhor palavra, mas tentar expor as nossas ideias de forma que as pessoas sintam que elas são universais. Eu escrevo porque as ideias que transbordam necessitam de ordem e podem ter maior alcance quando elas estão escritas. Eu escrevo também porque eu tenho o privilégio de fazê-lo.
So that process of writing is extremely important for all of us. We are now audio-visual, we are now social media, but I have to say that as an academic, I believe that there is still nothing more important than the written word.
One of the questions they asked us today is, why do we write? And I said there is a part of me that will keep quiet if I don't let the words come out.
When I feel angry, when I feel upset, when I feel devastated, I write to remind myself of who I am, remind myself of my struggles, and remind myself that my life and my lived experiences matter.
Pues yo creo que la escritura es la hoja en blanco, ¿no? Es un espacio político también que hay que tomar, ¿no?
We need to write about the language of human rights, we need to talk about social justice concepts, and we need to talk about the inherent value of civil society.
I feel that it is too important for me to continue writing for myself and for people in Pakistan, because I refuse to be erased, and I don't want people in my country to be erased.
Yo escribo para expresar mi rabia y mi indignación en relación a la injusticia y en relación a lo que no funciona bien en el mundo, a las exclusiones, a las opresiones. Entonces, es una forma de expresar lo que hay dentro de mí. Y escribo porque sé que hay personas que me leerán y que eso será importante de alguna manera. Creo que cuando escribimos siempre tocamos a alguien en algún momento, y esto lo digo porque también muchas personas me han tocado a través de lo que escribieron, entonces por eso escribo.
Great. So it's just to give you a flavour of kind of why, not just we're going to be talking largely about strategies this evening, but I think actually just to reinforce how important it has been through this process to document, to write, and to facilitate a process through which the activists can exchange that, that written word and also do it beyond writing. So, I mean, just very quickly then, before I hand over, just a couple of takeaways I get from when I look at the text. I think, firstly, what comes through to me is that civil society activists and groups recognise the necessity and the effectiveness of using multifaceted strategies to resist and to remain resilient when confronted with the complexity and the intensity of multifaceted restrictions and violence against them. Secondly, I think activists highlight through the text the importance of coalition and alliance building within and beyond the human rights movement, given the existential threat to and the broad targeting of civic freedoms and groups who dissent and challenge entrenched state and corporate power. But they also reflect on how incredibly challenging it is to do coalition building and to sustain that under these kind of pressures. And then lastly, I think activists are offering one another experiences of what has worked and not in context. Their texts don't propose transplanting models or even sort of put forward, best practices, inverted commas, but emphasize, I think, adaptation to context. That's what really comes through to me, is that adaptation of strategy to context. But here are some ideas, here are some things that we've tried and we've done in our context. So adapting to those, often rapidly changing environments. And I think, lastly, these and other insights that come from the reading of the author's text have implications for policymakers, for practitioners, for funders wanting to support effective strategies of resistance and resilience. But I'll stop there and we'll perhaps come back to those implications, I'm sure, as we get further into the conversation, and we'll hand over to colleagues to really talk about those strategies.
Okay, thank you very much, James. I'd like to invite Juana to say some words, please.
Okay. I'm a little bit touched. How to say emocionada? ¿Cómo se dice?
Sí.
Because we dreamed about that for a long time. I know that people in the video, not a lot of people in the audience. Thank you for being here. And thank you, James, for the collaboration. It was amazing to be doing this. That started as a dream. So thank you for the collaboration, and thank you for all the partners that organized the meeting with us today, the University of London, UCL, the University of York, and FIX, around there. So I thought about sharing with you 3 points. Why SUR? Why a SUR journal issue on shrinking civic space? And a little bit about what is happening in Brazil, to complement what I think you have seen in the newspapers around here. So why the SUR journal? And I took my copy. So we published, this is an academic journal of human rights in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So I have my copy that is entirely in Spanish, so you don't need to be English reader to be able to share the knowledge with people in other regions. So we do this since 2003. We are an NGO in Brazil. We do in 3 languages. We distribute it free of charge. It's available online free of charge without any password. And it's also done on Creative Commons. So you can copy, translate it, and use it as you want. I don't know how many of you have gone to the university and then left the university. I did Essex. And when I came back, I realized that I didn't have the key to the library anymore. That is, you don't have the password to JSTOR. And the idea is that the SUR journal breaks that and shows that that is possible. And you've heard that I sit on the panel of experts from the field of the Business and Human Rights Journal. And it has a key. So I sit on the board, but I cannot read it. So that's the importance of having a journal that everybody can read without a password in any language, and you can even translate it into your own language without asking us permission. So we have been doing that since 2003. And why it's called SUR, that is south? And that's the point. I think it relates with the video. Is the academic writing is influential in the way we describe the world. So when you name things, you create the categories you're going to use to describe even your own reality. Our feeling, and my feeling, I've been working in human rights since very, very young. I was working in Argentina, now in Brazil, is that we, human rights activists in the South, tend to describe our reality with categories that have not been created by us. We read literature that has been written in English and in the North, and we use that. And it's difficult to explain, but I know it has an impact if the categories have not been created by you. And the best example I have, and I don't have many examples, and if you can help me, I would appreciate it, is the issue of transitional justice, for example. Transitional justice was something that happened in Chile and Argentina, and then it was conceptualized in the US. So it includes justice, reparation, memory, and vetting. But it doesn't include the issue of social equality or social inequality. It's only now, with the debates in Colombia, that the issue of land is related to transitional justice. We are sure, we think that if the idea of the concept has been created in Colombia, it would have been included since the very beginning, the issue of equality. So the invitation, doing a journal from the South, is for activists and academics to create also categories of thinking. It's not only describing facts, but it's also doing theory. It's true that we are only a vehicle. So if you don't have the investment in the universities, the vehicle is not enough. So we have that trade-off that is difficult. And the retreat, in a way, was a way to support people to write. Because we don't have, especially activists, we don't have the practice of writing about what we do. And it's not like against the North. It's to complement. It's having more diversity of voices. So for me, the idea when I say SUR is diversities. We already have the North, let's bring the South. And I thought that because we have been doing it for 15 years, maybe it was not necessary anymore, that the message was there and that we impacted the main publication, but the fact is not. There was a recent evaluation of Conectas and other initiatives, and they took the last 2 issues of Sur Journal and also Human Rights Quarterly and Human Rights in Practice. And you know, at least when I studied in Essex, Human Rights Quarterly was like the Bible. And they are not called the North Human Rights. They are called Human Rights Quarterly and Human Rights in Practice, as it was the whole practice of human rights. And in the last 2 issues, for example, Human Rights in Practice, they published 25 authors from the North and 4 from the South. And Human Rights Quarterly, they publish 43 from the north and 2 from the south. So there's still a need for us to say, we are here also. And I think we want both to be more balanced, them and the Sur Journal also. And recently, there's another example. The Oxford Bibliography on Business and Human Rights was published in 2013. The issue of business and human rights started in 2011, more or less, when the Ruggie principles were adopted. You could say, well, there's already some trends, it's more balanced. It's not. It's 90% authors from the north, again. So there's still a need for us to say, listen, people, we also think, we also produce knowledge, we also produce concepts. And that's the idea behind the journal. But this issue was very much influenced by what James said, was about bringing practitioners, people really on the front line. We have seen a lot of diagnosis by specialists, but we wanted people that were like confronting the shrinking civic space in the front to reflect. And I think we managed to do something that is very much on first person, people reflecting on their own experience. And I was discussing with some people, I think we are in a moment of transition of formats of knowledge. We are not really sure what people are reading and what is influencing people's minds. So we are still struggling to find a format that is shorter than a very academic journal and that it's also first-hand. So please read it and make your comments because we are learning. I think we still need to struggle on the right format for what we read now. For me, as Brazilian, being in Brazil, the journal left me very clearly 3 strategies to fight what is happening in Brazil. First of all, they need to analyze the context and have a diagnosis. And I don't think we have it. We have been saying that Brazil is in a very bad shape regarding human rights and civil society, that now that it's worse, we don't have the right tools to say, look, it's worse, because we were already saying. So I like a lot the piece by Victoria that says they collect data and they reflect on that data in a periodic basis. Also the piece by Estefania explaining how coalitions are difficult to keep running and how important it is to have people from different places in the country. You cannot have a coalition to resist shrinking of civic space only in the capitals. And the last piece I take from here to design my strategy is the piece on self-care and in care. And I think it was very courageous that we published that because it's kind of an intimate piece. It's talking about suffering, about not seeing your children. It's not normal for a human rights journal. And that's something that came through the COFO papers. And finally, I want to share a little bit about Brazil because I have the feeling that there's a part of the shrinking of civic space in Brazil that is not so much portrayed in the newspapers and the human rights literature. You have heard a lot about what is happening regarding democracy, a lot about human rights defender after the killing of Marielle, but there's a part that is not there, that is militarization of reality. And what can it be more shrinking of civic space than having more military power around everywhere in Brazil? So we have seen militaries coming into power in Brazil without the need to taking the arms. The gun? Yeah. It started at the end of the Dilma government with the Olympic Games, but then they also were called to do the security of prisons. Now we have the federal intervention in Rio de Janeiro, but militaries. There was a very problematic change in the legislation regarding military justice. So now a military that kills a civil will go to military justice. The whole process of receiving the refugees from Venezuela is done by military, by the army. And finally, and I think this was the one that opened the eyes of a lot of people, the day before Lula was going to be tried by the Supreme Court, the Chefe das Forças Armadas, the chief of the armed forces, said through a tweet what the Supreme Court should decide. So it was the army saying the Supreme Court what they should decide. And the problem is not what he said, it's the fact that there was no sanction by the president. So why we are facing this situation of militarization in Brazil is difficult to say, but I think it's because Brazil has a very imperfect process of transitional justice, almost no transition and no justice. It is a trend in the region. So we are seeing something similar in Mexico with a lot of the use of the armed forces in security. But I'm trying to, and this is really recent, so we don't have the complete picture. But I think we as a human rights organization, we need to be able to explain what are the problems, are the consequences of this. The first is that they bring very short-term solutions. So in security issues, they are called and they don't bring a real solution. What we have now brings impunity because they go to military justice that have a lower level of justice and less participation in democratic terms. So apart from the problem in principles, we have to show what are the problems in concrete terms. So that's where we are facing. I think that's our next challenge regarding shrinking civic space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juan. It's helpful, I think, some of the points you made under our resources pillar tonight, thinking about knowledge production in a space like the University of London and this building that houses a library, that those of us who produce knowledge on these issues have a responsibility to make sure it's accessible and to give a platform for those who are experiencing the things that we're producing knowledge about. So thank you for highlighting that really important point. Next, I would like to invite Stefania, who I think is going to be focusing especially on the resistance pillar.
Thank you. So, hello everyone. Following up on what Juana said, I also have this experience being an Eastern European that oftentimes our countries are considered as part of Europe, so where there are usually no problem with the rule of law or protection of human rights. And I always have to explain that actually there is quite a lot of problem and a growing problem. So I think that's why I really value the invitation to write a piece about Hungary and Eastern Europe to the Sur Journal, because I think it's also an important voice, and it's important to lay out that whatever is true for Western Europe might not be true for Eastern Europe. And I talk quite a lot about that in the article in the journal. But tonight I'd like to focus a bit more on the Hungarian context and also on one of the strategies that we use, strategies of resilience. So one of the key messages, I think, for me is that the closing space for civil society, or the shrinking space phenomenon, is really inseparable from the political movement that is happening, from the political trends that are happening. In our case, it's inseparable from the democratic backsliding that is happening in the country. In Hungary, and increasingly also in Poland, and probably also soon in the Czech Republic, every institution that could put limit on power is under attack. And this is happening in the name of sovereignty, in the name of protecting national sovereignty. However, this sovereignty is understood as only the democratically elected government's will. So you could rephrase it in a way that whatever serves the government interest and whatever protects that protects national sovereignty. So that can be also detected in the speech about shrinking civic space, but also there was one example that I really like, and I think it really enlightens the whole situation, is that during the election campaign, we had elections very recently, one private corporation was called out by one of the prominent government officials as meddling into Hungarian political affairs because they offered lower prices for electricity than the state company. It's also inseparable from the liberal and leftist parties lacking narrative, or struggling with showing a compelling narrative and showing power, lacking really a credible opposition. So NGOs become viewed as the opposition of the political party. It's inseparable from creating a parallel reality through fake news and government propaganda. It's also inseparable from the so-called cumulative radicalism that is so characteristic for illiberal democracies or autocracies. And it's a process in which the governing party has to increase the stakes, has to show that the enemy is more dangerous, so they have to respond with more strength. And this has been shown by political analysts that this is the nature of these political systems. And it's also inseparable from something uniquely, or maybe not uniquely, but very characteristically Eastern European, being apolitical, being afraid of engaging in public affairs because it was seen during the socialism before the change of the system as meddling into political affairs, as something that is not the place for the citizen to do. I'm sure everyone in this audience knows quite a lot about the closing space for civil society in Hungary, so I won't really go into the events, but I would like to highlight that the legislative proposals and the anti-NGO bill that was adopted in 2017, I think is just one part of the puzzle. What is even more harmful is two type of activities or two type of strategies that the government is following. One is the divide and conquer strategy, and that can happen through various means. One of them is, of course, funding. State funding is really important in our societies, in our countries, and especially for NGOs. And by centralizing the decision and making it a very political one, resources were drawn for organizations. And also it was very characteristic of our countries, Hungary and Poland as well, that there were put some restrictions or some attempts of restricting foreign funding coming into the country. And that it has a problem, not only draining resources, not only lacking resources, but also eroding solidarity within the movement, between civil society organizations. And also another tactic is that singling out few organizations or few activists and attacking them increasingly in the propaganda newspapers, so that other organizations or the other activists feel that they are somehow contaminated and they want to pull away from them in order to protect them, which is a natural reaction, but this is something that we as civil society organizations have to be very mindful of. And the second tactic is a hijacking of the language, the hijacking of institutions. So just to give you one example, the anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism financing institutions and mechanisms were hijacked not only in Eastern Europe but also in other parts of the world for restricting NGO space, starting from not being able to open a bank account in Berlin for a new organization, until claiming anti-terrorism financing as a reason to adopt a foreign-funded organization bill in my country. We started coalition building as one of the responses for these restrictions, and one of the key lessons that we learned is that coalition building won't really solve the underlying issues that civil society grapples with. So in the coalition we have to find answers to that. This process started in 2014, and since then we went through two phases: Coalition 1.0 and Coalition 2.0, as I call it in the article. And what we really learned is that having an external threat is important for bringing together the voices and keeping together. And also we learned that some sort of a startup kind of thinking and very action-oriented thinking that less inherent for NGOs and maybe also for academics, that we focus on doing something instead of thinking about why we are doing it, what's the strategy, and what's like the next step and what is the impact. was really key to overcome, or at least start to overcome, one of the issues that was there, is that before 2014 what we have seen are mostly sectoral cooperation. So human rights organizations working on human rights issues, green organizations working on environmental issues. But this external threat and this very action-oriented approach created trust among ourselves. So when you organize demonstrations with around 15,000 participants, that probably you have seen the pictures of, with a big heart written civil in it, that builds trust among you, and that kind of defines what are your common goals. And actually I think that's one of the most important impacts of this coalition building. And also learning to compromise. This is also something very Eastern European, that our societies, we have to learn, we have to kind of democratically grow up, in the sense that to learn that democracy is about compromising. It's not that, I have it my way, and if you don't agree with me, then you are stupid. So this is something that we learned also in the coalition from each other, really listening and building in different types of perspective. I think this is something, this type of attitude was really seen in the most recent elections that took place on April 8th. That opposition parties were infighting and using this kind of tactics to fight each other, while us voters, I feel, somehow grew up democratically, and we realized that we have to make compromises, we have to cooperate in order to achieve the result. That didn't quite work out the way we wanted, but that's a different story, and I'm happy to answer questions about that as well. And then the final note is that I think participation, as in a democracy, is also key for civil society organizations, and especially in coalition building. If you don't want to be seen as an elite group of organizations who have the resources, who fight, and that further dividing civil society and the movement, then you have to make enormous efforts and put enormous thinking into how to involve those less resourceful, those working on a volunteer basis, and those working especially outside of the capital, or outside of the big cities. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Stefania. It was great to get us thinking about one of the resistance strategies, the building of the coalition. You emphasized the importance of building trust, which can be quite an intangible thing to measure, learning to compromise, and ensuring that a wide range of civil society are involved in those coalitions, facilitating participation. So it'll be interesting to hear other experiences of coalition building. Next, I'd like to turn to Susan Jessup to give us some reflections under the resources pillar.
Sure, thank you. First, let me just tell you a little bit about the organization that I work with. Mama Cash is a feminist funder, and we're based in Amsterdam. We provide grants, financial grants, and also other kinds of resources to women's, girls, trans, and intersex people's rights groups around the world. The grantee partners that we fund are defending and advancing the rights of their constituencies in their communities, and we're privileged to hear from them every day about how they're changing the world. But we also see that they are dramatically under-resourced and under attack. A couple of quotes maybe to illustrate that point. We know that the state will use all of its force to silence us. I was fired for signing a peace petition. Work on women's political participation or sexuality could get you killed. These are some of the really chilling things that we hear from our partners. And I think we all know that this is a harsh moment for civil society generally, and I think it's particularly harsh for feminist activists who historically have been excluded and silenced. And what we see is that they are often some of the first targets in closing space contexts. So a couple of words about the article that we wrote. It's called Standing Firm, and it was co-authored by activists Lauren's one of them, and she'll talk in a moment, and donors. And it's drawn from a longer report of the same name that we published last year. And it shares learnings from a research initiative that we launched in 2016. And it went on for about a year and a half with the Urgent Action Fund in the US and 15 feminist activists from 6 different countries to try to understand better how closing space is affecting women and trans organizations in particular, and what implications that has for us as funders. So a few highlights from what we have learned with a focus on what is relevant for donors and donor practice. Some takeaways. First, closing space definitely is a gendered phenomenon, has gendered dimensions. Second, that it's actually not such a new phenomenon. And finally, of course, money matters, but how we fund is very crucial in difficult contexts. And I'll elaborate on each of those points briefly. First, to take the first two of them together, that closing space is gendered, and in the experience of feminist activists, and perhaps other activists as well, closing space is not entirely new. We undertook the research because we hear from our partners that closing space is real and that it's affecting their ability to move, to speak, to work freely. But they also say to us that this constrained space is, for their advocacy, isn't new. I think some of the restrictions and requirements of organizations and some of the obstacles to funding are somewhat newer, perhaps, and are, becoming more onerous. But the hostile climate to their kind of advocacy is not so new. Indeed, what we hear from feminist activists and women human rights defenders is that they're used to being attacked and vilified, and often in ways that are very particular and clearly gendered. Their work tends to challenge gendered norms about how women should be and behave, and both state and non-state actors respond to that with hostility and with smear campaigns, sexual harassment, and threats and violence, which are often sexualized. And I think that this is a really important reminder for us as donors that when we're working in these kinds of contexts and trying to support resilience, we need to not be focused only on legal and policy advocacy, obviously, so those are important, but we also need to be funding activism that's focused on norm change. What we see in closing space context often is that there's a real kind of heightened rhetoric that links patriotism and patriarchy and promotes very conservative gender norms as being in the national interest. And I think as long as those kinds of social norms are operative and discourage and punish women, girls, trans and intersex people from speaking out and acting politically, of course their space to operate will be smaller, will be reduced. So let me then turn to funding and how we resource and why that matters for building resistance and resilience. Mama Cash funds self-led groups all over the world. They all, or virtually all of them, have annual budgets of less than 200,000 euros a year. Many of them have dramatically smaller budgets. Some of them are not registered in the countries where they work. What does it take to make their work more sustainable? And how are we responding? The article that we wrote has a list of recommendations to funders. I'm going to focus on a few of them. Activists stress that core and long-term funding is very important, crucial in fact. Flexible funding, funding that supports movement building, and finally funding that's accessible to local, smaller, self-led groups. And I'll say just a few words about each of those things. Activists need core and long-term funding. It's the kind of funding that allows them to set their own priorities and agendas, to adapt to changing contexts, to invest in security and safety, and their own well-being, to strengthen their organizations so that they can respond quickly. And as self-evident as I think that seems, it's still really hard to access and to secure core funding. And they talk about the paradox of having funded projects but struggling to fund their organizations so that they have sufficient staff to implement the project. So Mama Cash has a commitment to providing core support, and we also prioritize long-term relationships with our partners and try to give as much of the funding that we give in multi-year grants. Second, a few words about flexible funding. I think flexible funding, by definition, allows activists to respond to what is characteristic of closing space contexts. That is, sometimes unexpected or unanticipated opportunities, but very often unanticipated threats and needs, as such as attending to activists' mental and physical health needs and safety needs. I think several members of the panel have mentioned those kinds of things already. Flexibility also in terms of how we actually even deliver the funding. Sometimes organizations can't receive it directly and need it to be directed through another safer organization, sometimes even into individual bank accounts. And I think our flexibility as funders to be able to try to do some of those things is important. Funding that facilitates movement building. Also, I think a question or a request that we get from partners often is, how can you facilitate our ability to come together and learn and share? And I think that that's also particularly important in climates where activists are being isolated from each other and where civil society is being fragmented. So we try to respond to that both formally and informally. Formally by supporting meetings and enabling activists to come together, but also informally just by linking activists with each other and trying to help them access resources that they need. For example, in the case of the research that I mentioned a few minutes ago, we convened the activists to review the report that we'd written before it was finalized so that they could validate the findings. So we had activists from 6 different countries, and I think it was interesting that they were all struck by the similarities, even in their disparate countries, by the kinds of challenges that they were facing. And that moment of being able to come together and talk to each other was, was a learning moment, but it also really was a moment in which I think activists felt less isolated and were energized, and that's important. We also used that particular meeting as an opportunity to offer some skill building and training on the issue of digital safety and security, which is being, I think we see that digital spaces are increasingly important for organizing, but it's also an increasingly unsafe space in some places. So those kinds of trainings are important. And finally, making funding available that smaller self-led local groups can access. We know that feminist and women's rights groups are underfunded in any case, and I think smaller self-led local groups tend to have the hardest time accessing funding. And it's important for donors really to think about how we can accept some of the risk in funding groups that may not yet be really well established. So I'll close with one other quote that's included in the article. One of the activists said to us, "When they close the door, we come in the window." And I think that statement speaks to the kinds of skills that activists who are navigating difficult spaces are developing. I think those kinds of skills will continue to be important because they expect that feminist activism will continue to be stigmatized and attacked in the foreseeable future. But their message to us is clear, I think. Stand with us as partners, especially now. Provide funding, but also we need other things like the sort of more intangibles: trust, solidarity, risk sharing. The context they're working in are changing regularly and dramatically. And I think there's a real important need for the funders to be talking to each other and talking to activists so that we understand better what's happening on the ground, how space is closing, and so that we can collectively build our understanding of how to better support activists in these kinds of situations. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. I think you highlighted really well, first of all, what should be funded, so what kind of aims, for example, normative change, what kind of activities, for example, bringing fundees together, and then these 5 principles of core funding, long-term funding, flexible funding, focusing on building movements and focusing on local groups. And I know we have many funders in the audience tonight, so it'd be interesting to hear your reflections of if you're having similar thinking, if you're using similar strategies, or if you're trying something different. And our final speaker for the panel is Helen, and in many ways she's going to be talking, I think, principally about resilience, and that's sort of a starting point really for many of the other things that we've been talking about tonight. So please, Helen.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me add my voice to my colleague here who thanked partners and donors who supported the research, but also for us to be able to share these findings. You've introduced ICIS Wiki as a feminist organization, but our focus is promoting women's participation in peace building and post-conflict reconstruction. So the context we work basically is conflict and post-conflict situations around the Great Lakes region in Africa. But my presentation, I'm going to be speaking on behalf of the activists, that we work together, but most examples could be mine, and there's, and we have a lot of things cut across us, like she said. Susan already talked about the fact that the nature of work of feminist organizations is complex in itself, normally. So you're dealing with situations where society finds what you're doing abnormal. You're challenging status quo, you're challenging practices that people are very comfortable with. So you're kind of trying to shift norms. And so the state uses that as an opportunity to restrict you more. So for example, if you're working on issues of sex work, if you're promoting the rights of sex workers or LGBTIs, and the state comes against you, everybody says yes. What they are doing is morally not correct. So there's kind of this legitimacy in terms of how your space is being closed, which is different from the mainstream closing space. And those are the issues that we are very happy that we are able to write from a feminist perspective, that even though we know all these places are closing, feminist spaces are also closing in a different way because of the nature of the work. And something I wanted to add to what Susan is saying as she was talking, I remember that a lot of donors have also closed their women's rights portfolios, pushing us into mainstream issues and forcing us to do mainstream things that we struggle to see how we can get a feminist perspective into it, because they don't want the language anymore. So I think generally there's also that aspect of closing space that we need to look at and find out from donors what happened. So you don't have a women's right anymore. So if you're a feminist organization and you work majorly on women's rights, they want you to look at it from a general perspective, which is not so easy most of the time. So we do affirm that closing space, yes, we're beginning to talk about it, but we also know that the issues and the kind of repressive and violence reactions we get as feminist organizations has been on, for a long time. Susanna said it. It's been there. We know that those challenges come because of the work that we do. But over the years, what have we done? And then what has worked? And how is state using their tools, the laws, the democratic tools and governance to restrict more the work that we do? One example, and we are seeing the trend in Africa, is restricted access to funding for human rights organizations. So you have states asking that if you're doing human rights work, you should not receive more than 10 or 20% of your funding from outside. And the debate around this is, if you're promoting LGBTI rights, it's seen as a Western agenda. So why should the money come from outside to do that work? And so if you're promoting sex work, it means it's a Western agenda. And we do ask them, sex work is not new in all the contexts we know. It's as historic as many of the things we know. So why would someone think that because you're receiving money to do such work, then it's a Western agenda? But then your organization is put under surveillance. They want to see the money coming in and going out. So many times it's problematic for organizations promoting this kind of rights to receive funding. But also another trend that we see is governments are asking organizations, human rights organizations, to renew their registrations every year. Every year you have to renew your registration. So if you've done anything contrary to what the state wants, your registration will not be renewed. So that's another way. So you become like a good organization, you don't need to talk about those issues, and so on and so forth. So how are we surviving this? In terms of surviving, we've tried to look at doing advocacy work at national, regional, and international level. Why is it important to do at different levels? There are some things you can afford to talk about if you're a feminist organization. Gender-based violence, for example, if you're promoting for a law about that, that's okay. You know, those are those women's things, you can talk about it, we don't mind, we give you the space. We can sign it into law or nothing. So it's like, continue to make your noise, that's fine. But then when you want to talk about issues, you know, which the state thinks is morally not correct, they bring in morality debates, they bring in the church and everything around it. It's difficult for you to talk about it. For example, you can't talk about LGBTI rights in a state where there is a law against those rights, or sex work, where it is illegal in those societies. So if you wanted to advocate for these rights, what we do is coalition building, but across countries, so that other people speak on your behalf. Because you couldn't talk about it. Once you talk about it, you're targeted. You know, sometimes people hold workshops, they do not disclose the venue of the workshops. Many times workshops were closed because they were talking about things that the state does not accept. So hotels were invaded, participants were driven away because they were sex workers or because they were LGBTI groups. So they are not allowed to exist. They cannot have activities. Hotels are warned not to have them. So in those situations, these activities have to happen outside the country. So it also requires what we talk about flexibility in the funding, that if you had received money to have this workshop within the country, but the situation does not allow you, you will have flexibility to relocate somewhere else and still have the same activity if that state allows. So it depends on the state where you're moving and how much disclosure you could have. In some situations, we have had to call events other names. So for example, ISIS Wiki is supporting some women from Burundi to do work. The donor does not want anyone to know they are supporting the women because they are in country and it's not safe for them. So ISIS Wiki could take the responsibility to organize a leadership training for women in peace building. But within that space, we are strategizing on how to ensure that women are in the peace process. So there's that kind of strategy that you have to adopt to be able to protect these women who could actually be killed if they are found to be doing that, whose family could be attacked if they are found to be doing that. So it's a bit of, it's risky, but you need to do something. So that kind of international organizing that allows activists, feminists to do things in different ways, that flexibility that donors need to allow has worked, you know, in terms of how this is, and that collaboration and networking. So many times in this work, you need to situate the rights you're promoting within international instruments. So you need to use that to argue why things should not happen the way they happen. And you couldn't take it to your parliament, you couldn't take it to the court, because at national level, it is illegal. So you take it to international institutions, the Human Rights Council. You can take it to the UN. We've also seen situations where it is difficult, even at the African Human Rights Commission, but at least it's documented. At least they can come in by themselves and try to document and then hold states accountable. So I think working from that level has also been useful in holding states accountable. But we also understand how difficult it is for states themselves to listen to this, you know, or some of the issues that we took to ICC. We've seen that nobody has been arrested, others have been arrested. So there is hope that we can continue to engage with international frameworks, working with international partners and coalitions to be able to hold our leaders accountable. The other strategy that has worked for us is social media, because it provides alternative channel, for us to remain vocal, to say the things the way we want to say it, but it is not totally very safe. So many times you can tweet and there's a counter tweet about what you have said. So you have specific people following you on Twitter. Once you say something, someone immediately counters it. So it's like a continuous fight. Sometimes they try to threaten you. Other times they abuse you. They use bad words on you. They insult you. So if you tweeted something about the rights of lesbians and gays, somebody asks, "Are you a lesbian?" on Twitter. So those kind of attacks are the things that we have to deal with. But what happens is that when you do that, you have support from outside. You have many people talking about that issue and tagging specific people, and the message, for me, I believe, it goes across. But the state does not rest. So once they find out that that is happening, for example, in the elections in Uganda, in Kenya, social media was shut down by the government. So people couldn't tweet, people couldn't go on Facebook. So we then look for alternative means to remain connected and talk about election results. And so talking about, the connecting human rights issues to political issues, you can't separate them many times because you're promoting human rights. So they also find ways to try to restrict you even when you go on social media. But what have we also done is to try to request, like Mama Cash said, Susan has mentioned it, trainings on security, digital security. How do we make our information more secure? And for us as an organization that does a lot of documentation and research, is how do we make sure that our information is intact and is safe? Because organizations are being raided, and their computers are being taken. Sometimes they make it look like it's theft, but laptops are lost, things are taken from this, and you can lose information. So how do you make sure that you have multiple sites where this information is saved and you don't lose it totally as an organization? The other strategy that has worked is filing of lawsuits to challenge repressive actions. So for example, in Uganda, we have the public management bill that does not allow you to gather outside without the permission of the police. So in terms of our movement building and advocacy, you couldn't have a public event that that can reach more people, except the police. So you write to the police, then they respond to you. And so there's been an argument about what does the law say. It says inform the police. It doesn't say they must permit you. But by that time they have arrested you and taken you off the road, but we continue to go to court to challenge it so that we can legitimize our actions. Otherwise you're not allowed to do the usual campaigns that you do without interruption from the police or the army. The other things that we have also been doing is solidarity networks, building networks around issues that we know is complex, within countries for them to deal with, so that people can talk from outside. We've been struggling with the issues of Burundi. So now we are trying to build a network of African peace activists to see how they can engage in that process so that the voices are coming from different African countries for the same issue. We've also been having intergenerational dialogues because we believe that even as many of us get burnt out, many times once you get to 50, 55, 60, that energy goes down. And we need to continuously have this engagement and conversation with young people and share what we're doing and let's challenge them to see what they can do differently, but what can they learn from others who are getting older in terms of keeping the strategy alive. But also another thing that has worked for feminist organizations in terms of funding, because Susanna said it, the monies that we receive is really not much, it's a little. And many times donors put, like if they want to give you money, you could have had like $1 million per annum. I don't know how many women's organizations do that in Africa. So building consortiums, strategizing to fundraise together, to be able to meet that threshold that donors have put is also something that we see that is working. But in terms of doing that, then you have to look at for an organization that you share the same values. Because also if you don't have the same values, then there's going to be a challenge in terms of how money is used. What kind of structures do you put in place for you to be able to do that? But we think that it's something that is working, and we could actually learn from it for those who have worked. I've talked to a lot of colleagues to ask them, so how are you getting this money? Say, Helen, just go and build a consortium. I said, oh, okay. So it's something that we need to begin to do. And then I asked myself, so who is that person? I don't know, but I mean, it has worked. And they say, you want millions? Get into a consortium. So it's also like pushing us into what we don't know. And is this practice of trying to fall within what donors want? Because they just wake up and they say, okay, now this is what we want and we're trying to ship. And yet we need to get money to do the work. Finally is the issue of self-care. You know, we talked about it, and Susanna asked me, so in practical terms, how do you do self-care within the organization? And then I smiled and said, you know, this work we do is very difficult, and sometimes you can get so consumed at your desk without knowing that you're actually being traumatized, and you're traumatizing everyone around you because of the pressures in the environment. So in my organization, we came up with a structure we call happiness manager. So we articulated amongst ourselves, and I said to her, it's a conversation that you ask yourselves, what can work for us within this context where we are working? And we developed a job prescription for her. I said, your job description is make sure that you're able to assess how everyone is doing and see how you can bring us together and let them debrief. Because when you talk about your experience, individual experience, it helps. But also when you talk about your collective experience, it helps. So when the government started invading organizations in Uganda, we had a conversation that we said, you know, how do we work to protect ourselves? One, everyone leaves the office at the same time. Don't leave anyone here, because someone could come if they know that someone is here. So let them come, they can invade here when we are not there. Two, back up every day your computers, make sure. And Helen, don't take your things to the house. They can trace you to your home because they know you might be the one who is backing up the organization. So we have those practical conversations in terms of our own safety and safety of the organization, but also creating time for us to have fun, you know, within the work that we do. So on Fridays, we have happy hour. So in our happy hour, we just go and drink whatever it is. And then we go home. So it's okay, happy hour time, we close 3 o'clock instead of 4, we close 2, whatever it is, and we go and eat pizza, whatever we can afford, but something different. Sometimes we get someone to come and take us through yoga, you know, sometimes we do dance. It could be spontaneous, and that is why we decided to have a position of someone. It's not a full-time position, of course, because we don't have enough staff, but it's something we added on someone, just for us to make sure that there's something we're doing for ourselves. Otherwise, no one is going to, somebody said to me, Helen, no one is going to remember that you're stressed. You need to think about it yourself. This thing goes on, and if you die, your body will just call for advert and employ someone else. So how do you make sure that in the work that you do among you and your colleagues, you're taking care of yourself? To be able to take care of your mental health, not just security of yourself, but your mental health, and you're able to do the work that you do, because some of the issues are very difficult. And finally, I think continuous learning and collaboration is needed. That space where we can sit together as activists and talk about what has worked for us and how is very, very important. But I also agree, you know, with my colleagues who talk about writing, you know. And for us, we don't have the time to write. You really need to pull us like Mama Cash did and take us to another space, because continuously we are running from one thing to the other, from one thing to the other. So even if we had time to write, it would be proposals, we don't have time to reflect on the work that we do, more so the nature of it and how we could strategize. So I think we need that space where we continuously talk about it, what has worked for us, so that others could learn, and we can also continuously re-energize ourselves. But that feeling that you're not alone is the most important. You know, that solidarity, that you know that these things are happening. It's universal. It's not just happening in your own context, I think is something that, you know, has also been very useful in the work that we've done. I'll start.
Thank you, Helen, for sharing some really practical tips about self-care and emphasizing really the mental health dimension of that. Since we're talking about women's human rights organizations in Bloomsbury, it's worth remembering that the famous writer Virginia Woolf said, "A woman needs a room of her own and money to write." So we obviously have put an emphasis on that. And I liked, in terms of resilience and resistance, your emphasis on the role of international allies, either in neighboring states or in other parts of the world. That might be something for us to think about as well, many of you working for international allied organizations. Before we turn to the floor, I would like to invite two groups of researchers just to share briefly some of the work that they've been doing on this topic. I'd like to first invite Alice Na, who's lecturer from the Center for Applied Human Rights at the University of York, where she's principal investigator in a large project examining the experience of human rights defenders at risk in Colombia, Mexico, Egypt, Kenya, and Indonesia. Alice, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Shall I stand?
Please, yeah.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be with you here today. Thank you so much for inviting us to be part of, hosting this session. It's such a marvelous resource what you've created. It's so wonderful and so timely and so important. And I'm so excited to be able to set these as readings for my students so that we continue the conversations. Because I think also part of when I teach, I think this is the next generation. They have to carry the torch. They have to continue what we're struggling so hard for. And I really, a lot of what all of you presented really resonated so much with me as an activist, and also with the research that we're doing. And on the topic of well-being, what we found in our study was that it's still actually a really difficult conversation to have with activists. What's the point of revolution if they can't dance? That was 10 years ago. And so rich and so powerful. And when I read it, it really spoke so much to me, which is why we focus on well-being in our study. But still, they are hard conversations because we are a movement that has sacrificed a lot. And we remember those who have sacrificed, and we also feel the need to sacrifice, And I think we need to really explore these norms that shape our own behaviors. One of the things that came out as a strong theme as well is that defenders suffer, but they find it hard to talk about it, And so they rely, even the coping mechanisms are often quite private methods, talking to friends, having hobbies, drinking. But what I'm really interested in is how can we build organizations that support self-care, and collective care, importantly, that doesn't see it as a luxury, that doesn't see it as self-indulgent, but, even in very practical ways, let's not just talk about philosophy or yoga or whatever, but pension plans, health insurance, holidays, making sure we work to time, between 9 to 5 as much as possible, and not reinforce that, if we're not on call 24/7, we're not real activists, It's these kind of cultures of, just looking after ourselves as human beings. I think that's so important, I think the second thing that really resonated to me from what you shared was, security training, like you said, it shouldn't be the trainer tells activists what to do. It should really, I think what the activists in our study were saying was, it's so important to facilitate spaces for self-reflection and for political analysis, for joint analysis of what's going on, So it's not about, the northerners telling the southerners what to do, but it's really about us reflecting on ourselves and our own practices and doing things that are within our grasp in our day-to-day practices, not a long list of things we need to do, which becomes too cumbersome and difficult, but what are the daily routines that we can shape, and change so that our security is strengthened. And I think the third area is actually the importance of families and loved ones in our work. And that came out really strongly amongst our defenders. A lot of times their families were targeted. And that is so painful for defenders, especially women defenders. I mean, men of course as well. But you have this guilt that, you suffer the risks, you in a way are aware of the risks, but should your family suffer for that, But then also for LGBTI defenders and, people working on sex worker rights, actually their families also turn against them. So it's not just, we also need to think about how we can work with families to build support mechanisms around defenders. So thank you so much for producing such a wonderful resource. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice, for sharing some excellent thoughts and reflections from research on the resilience point. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. We're going to have to draw to a close for this part of the session, but we'd like to invite you to a reception in the Jessel room, which is just behind me. You can get it to by the corridor here, so please continue to ask questions and debate with our guests. I would like to thank our panelists who've come from, most of them from very, very far away, to speak tonight and share your thoughts and experiences. So please join me in a round of applause for that.